In the world of Fallout, the phrase, "war never changes," is more than a narration. It is prophecy, epitaph, and confession, spoken at the dawn of every age. Its words echo through centuries of ruin, a refrain that outlives the nations that birthed it. Humanity has risen and fallen beneath the same flag of conflict so many times that the idea of peace itself feels like a myth, a ghost that never belonged to this world. The story begins not in the ashes of the wasteland, but in the beating heart of pre-war America, when civilization stood at the pinnacle of its own design, a monument to progress and paranoia. Beneath the chrome and optimism of the atomic age, the seeds of destruction had already taken root, hidden beneath the promises of plenty, whispered in the boardrooms of corporations that no longer served men but ruled them. The world's end did not begin with a missile launch, but with a transaction. Greed was the first bomb, ignorance the second, and ambition the final detonation that turned an age of innovation into an age of extinction. Humanity built miracles and called them machines. It built monsters and called them soldiers. It built weapons and called them peace. And when the moment came that one nation looked to another across the thinning oil fields and empty mines, the world remembered what it had never truly forgotten: that war is not a failure of mankind's progress, but its inevitable product. Long before the Great War reduced civilization to dust, conflict had become culture. Children learned to pledge allegiance not to ideals, but to survival through strength. Politicians waged battles not in trenches, but in markets and laboratories. Every nation prepared for the end they secretly knew was coming, each believing it could endure the fire better than the rest. Yet when the bombs fell, they fell on everyone equally. No flag could shield against radiation, no slogan could stop annihilation. In 20 minutes, all that humanity had built, the glittering cities, the endless highways, the dreams of a perfect tomorrow, vanished beneath mushroom clouds that bloomed like iron flowers. And still, even as the world burned, the voice of man did not cry out in repentance, but in defiance. War never changes, because man never changes. The survivors who crawled from the ashes did not see a world free of the old order, but an open battlefield waiting to be claimed anew. The wasteland became both grave and cradle, a place where the remnants of the past fought to shape the future in their own image. The bombs had wiped the slate clean, but they could not erase the hand that held the chalk. In the centuries that followed, the ruins of the old world became scriptures of a lost faith. The cracked walls of vaults, the rusting hulks of tanks, and the skeletons of cities stood as monuments to the same truth written across time, that mankind, in its hunger for meaning, returns always to struggle. From the ashes of governments rose warlords, from the ashes of soldiers rose raiders, from the ashes of nations rose empires, dressed in rags and hubris. Some claimed to rebuild civilization, others sought only to rule what was left of it. But all marched beneath banners stained by the same inherited sin. Even the Brotherhood of Steel, born from a moment of guilt and rebellion, became guardians of war's memory, hoarding the weapons of the old world as relics of power rather than warnings of folly. In the vaults, isolated from the wastes, humanity conducted new experiments, not in peace, but in control. Every experiment, every ideology, every law written in the dust carried within it the echo of the old world's downfall. The bombs had changed the landscape, but not the heart, and in every heart still beat the rhythm of conflict, steady, patient, eternal. War never changes, and neither does the creature that gives it life. In the years before the Great War, America ceased to be a nation of people and became a machine of profit, a system built to consume itself in the pursuit of endless growth. The dream that once promised liberty and equality mutated into an economy of dependency, where corporations replaced governments and citizenship was measured not in patriotism but in purchasing power. The United States of the late 21st century was not ruled by presidents or generals but by executives, men and women who understood that control did not come from ballots or bullets, but from ownership. Robco, Voltec, Poseidon Energy, General Atomics, Nuka-Cola, and Repcon were not merely companies, they were empires, and each carved out a dominion over some essential fragment of human life. It was an era where war itself was privatized long before the bombs fell, because every invention meant to secure peace became another commodity in the global marketplace. The military-industrial complex had long ago devoured the republic that spawned it, and what remained was a hollowed-out ideal, the flag of the United States fluttering proudly above a system that no longer served its people, but the shareholders who owned their future. The seeds of this transformation were planted during the resource wars. When oil reserves dwindled, uranium fields were seized, and nations began to treat survival as a business transaction. In that desperate age, America rebranded its identity to match its ambitions. Propaganda promised prosperity through consumption, comfort through obedience, and safety through strength. Citizens were sold hope in bottles and heroism in advertisements. The Great Depression, the Dust Bowl, and 2 world wars had taught humanity to endure hardship, but the 21st century taught it to profit from crisis. Corporations like Voltec thrived in fear, turning the paranoia of nuclear annihilation into a marketing strategy. Vaults were not built as sanctuaries of safety, but as laboratories of control, carefully curated experiments meant to shape, test, and redefine the post-war human condition. Each vault represented a contract between a corporation and a terrified public, a promise signed in panic. In the boardrooms of the old world, human life was no longer sacred. It was a variable to be measured, catalogued, and optimized for efficiency. The transformation of America into a corporate state was gradual but deliberate. The federal government, weakened by economic turmoil and global isolation, leaned on private industry to manage its essential functions. Military production was outsourced to Robco, power infrastructure to Poseidon Energy, communications to Repcon, and West Tech. When the nation's fate became inseparable from its profit margins, policy was no longer written in Congress, but dictated in corporate strategy meetings. West Tech, under government contract, created the forced evolutionary virus, a discovery that promised human advancement, but revealed the moral bankruptcy of those who funded it. In the name of progress, the company unleashed the seed of humanity's own mutation, a symbol of the blurred line between science and sin. That line would dissolve completely when the same virus that birthed supermutants became a weapon in the hands of those who saw evolution not as destiny, but as property. It was in this world of silent coups and smiling propaganda that the American people became consumers first and citizens second. The Pip-Boy, the Nuka-Cola, the Mr. Handy Robot, each a tool of convenience that doubled as a leash, teaching humanity to depend on its inventions while forgetting how to survive without them. Automation promised leisure, but it also erased purpose. Factories ran without hands, armies fought without soldiers, and homes cleaned themselves, while families forgot how to speak to one another. The machines that liberated humanity from labor also separated it from meaning. And so, when the bombs finally fell, it was not simply civilization that perished, but the illusion of progress itself. For all their brilliance, the pre-war engineers had only perfected one thing: the art of creating their own extinction. Even as global tensions rose, corporate optimism endured. Advertising agencies continued to sell a vision of the future bright, with atomic energy and robotic prosperity. The smiling face of the Vault Boy appeared on every billboard, promising safety, security, and a better tomorrow. But beneath that grin lay the quiet horror of inevitability. The awareness that no system built on exploitation could last forever. The American dream had become a brand, a product to be packaged and sold, and, like all products, it had an expiration date. Those who questioned the system were ignored or silenced. The media, itself owned by conglomerates, repeated the same comforting slogans until the truth was buried beneath layers of repetition. War never changes, they might have said even then, but in that age, it was not yet a lesson learned. It was a prophecy waiting to be fulfilled. And so, by the year 2077, the line between nation and corporation had vanished completely. The government's final acts before the Great War were dictated not by elected officials, but by industrial lobbyists, ensuring their investments survived. When President Richardson, years later, as part of the Enclave, would speak of reclaiming America, he was not restoring a democracy. He was reviving the old system of control, the union of power and profit that defined the pre-war age. In his words, the ghosts of those corporate barons still spoke, guiding their descendants to repeat the same mistakes under a new banner. For them, war was never a failure. It was the ultimate business opportunity. What made the corporate states so tragic was not their corruption, but their inevitability. Humanity's pursuit of comfort and control had always been the path to its undoing. Every invention born from fear became a tool of subjugation. Every dream of progress carried the seeds of decay. The atomic age was humanity's final mirror, reflecting its most sacred contradictions: genius without wisdom, ambition without restraint, prosperity without morality. When the bombs fell, they did not end a civilization, they completed its design. The fire that consumed the world was simply the last transaction in a ledger written over centuries, a balance paid in full. And in the silence that followed, the phrase finally found its meaning. War never changes. It was no longer a warning or a lament. It was history's confession that progress, for all its glory, had never been anything more than a prettier name for conflict. By the dawn of the 21st century's final decades, the world had already begun to rot beneath the illusion of prosperity, and the resource wars were the smell of that decay made visible. The earth, long plundered and poisoned by industry, had little left to give, yet humanity's appetite only deepened with every invention designed to make life easier and every war fought to protect that ease. Oil, uranium, and fresh water, commodities once taken for granted, became the lifeblood of nations and the currency of survival. The conflict that would eventually ignite the Great War did not begin with soldiers or speeches, but with shortages. When the wells ran dry and the pipelines emptied, civilization turned on itself with the precision of a machine built for destruction. The nations of the Old World were not enemies by ideology, but by necessity, each fighting not for dominance, but for the right to continue existing for one more generation. The year 2052 marked the beginning of the end, when the European Commonwealth, starved of petroleum, turned its gaze toward the Middle East. What began as trade disputes escalated into open warfare as energy convoys were bombed embargoes broken, and peace treaties shredded by desperation. The United States, still reeling from the collapse of its global economy, watched from across the ocean as Europe and the Middle East devoured one another, their cities burning in the name of the last remaining oil fields on Earth. While foreign powers bled each other dry, America found itself facing its own unraveling. The Alaskan oil reserves, the nation's final source of black gold, became its most precious possession. When China, desperate to sustain its population and industry, invaded Alaska in 2066, the conflict expanded beyond borders and ideologies. It became a race between two dying empires, each blinded by the belief that victory could outlast extinction. For a decade, the Anchorage front line became a symbol of both heroism and futility, where soldiers fought and froze over barren tundra, dying to protect oil that no longer mattered. It was there that America perfected the power armor, an invention that turned men into walking fortresses and blurred the line between soldier and machine. The T-45D, and later the T-51B, represented humanity's obsession with technological superiority, the belief that with enough armor, one could survive even the end of the world. The Anchorage Reclamation Campaign eventually pushed back the Chinese forces, but the victory was hollow. The cost was measured not in resources gained, but in the morality lost along the way. War had become the only constant, an addiction too deeply embedded to end even when there was nothing left to fight for. The resource wars also marked the death of diplomacy. The United Nations, paralyzed by indecision and corruption, dissolved in 2059 after years of irrelevance. Without a global authority to mediate, every nation became an island, arming itself against its neighbors and its own citizens. Riots broke out across the planet as famine and fuel shortages spread. In the United States, martial law was declared in major cities, and food riots became so frequent that the government authorized lethal suppression under the guise of restoring order. The media called it patriotism. History would call it desperation. Voltaire's influence grew during this time, using the chaos as justification for its societal preservation program. What the public saw as a humanitarian effort, the construction of vaults to save the population from potential nuclear catastrophe, was, in truth, an extension of the same corporate opportunism that had caused the crisis. Each vault represented not salvation, but experiment, an investment in the post-war future where humanity itself would become the product. The West Tech Corporation played its own part in the story, funded by the US government to develop the Forced Evolutionary Virus, FEV, under the guise of military bioengineering. What began as an attempt to create immune, radiation-resistant soldiers revealed the government's deeper fear, not just of losing wars, but of losing control. The virus would later escape containment, mutating both the body and the philosophy of mankind. It was a testament to the age, a time when science had forgotten its conscience, when progress meant perfecting the tools of annihilation. By 2070, when the new plague, later dubbed the Blue Flu, swept across the United States, paranoia reached its peak. The disease, possibly engineered, or at least mishandled by the very institutions sworn to protect humanity, became the final justification for the government's complete militarization. Civilian rights eroded under the weight of fear, and the enclave, the secretive remnant of America's political elite, began preparing contingency plans to preserve their version of civilization at any cost. In Europe, famine and disease turned entire countries into graveyards. Refugee crises destabilized borders, and nuclear exchanges between smaller powers became increasingly common. The global environment collapsed. Dust storms consumed farmland, seas acidified, and radiation leaked from overused reactors and forgotten weapon caches. Humanity had reached the limits of its endurance, and instead of adapting, it fought harder. Each war created the illusion of temporary relief, but every victory was another wound in the planet's body. When nations could no longer sustain themselves, they cannibalized their own infrastructure, melting machines for metal and repurposing civilian industries into weapons factories. It was not that humanity failed to learn from history, it simply refused to believe it was repeating it. By the mid-2070s, the war economy had become the world economy. In the United States, propaganda transformed suffering into spectacle. The government promised victory through strength and unity, while concealing the truth. The after-sub-country was fractured beyond repair. The middle class had evaporated, replaced by a servile population dependent on rationing and corporate employment. Robcos, Protectrons, and Mr. Handy robots patrolled the streets in place of police, while General Atomic sentry bots stood watch over increasingly restless citizens. The illusion of stability was maintained through force and distraction, entertainment, consumerism, and military pride. Fallout's America was one where peace was no longer even a political objective. It was a liability. The perpetual state of war had become essential to keeping the machinery of society alive. The final years before the Great War were a crescendo of madness. In 2076, the United States celebrated its tricentennial anniversary, a hollow festival of patriotism masking the reality of a dying empire. The Anchorage victory was paraded as proof of American resilience. Yet, behind the celebration, whispers of nuclear mobilization spread. The military stockpiled atomic warheads faster than they could count them, and the slightest diplomatic misstep risked total annihilation. Then, on the 23rd of October 2077, the inevitable happened. No one knows who struck first. Perhaps China, perhaps America, perhaps an automated defense system triggered by the fear it was meant to prevent. In 20 minutes, the resource wars reached their final conclusion, not with treaties or peace, but with fire. The earth burned, and the sky followed. The very resources over which billions had died were rendered worthless in an instant, consumed in atomic heat. And yet, in that annihilation lay the ultimate irony. The resource wars were never truly about resources. They were about fear, the fear of loss, of inadequacy, of extinction. The oil wells and uranium mines were only symbols of a deeper hunger that no amount of energy could satisfy. Humanity had long confused survival with dominance, progress with consumption. The wars were the logical endpoint of a civilization that had built its identity on conquest. When the bombs fell, they did not destroy something pure. They merely revealed what had always been there. The flames did not change humanity. They clarified it. The Great War was not a sudden apocalypse. It was the final chapter of a book that humanity had been writing since the first spark of civilization. And when the ashes settled, the phrase that would define the centuries to come was not born from poets or prophets, but from the simple truth that echoed across every ruin. War never changes. On the morning of the 23rd of October 2077, humanity reached the end of its own arithmetic. Centuries of competition, greed, and fear resolved themselves in 20 minutes of fire. It began without warning and ended without survivors to tell who struck first. Alarms blared across the globe. Radar screens bloomed with impossible numbers, and the sky filled with the last vocabulary of civilization mushroom clouds rising like monuments to arrogance. The Great War was not fought for conquest or ideology. It was fought by ghosts of nations already dead, machines following orders no one had the courage to cancel. In America, the Civil Defense Network triggered its counterstrikes even as cities like Boston, Los Angeles, and Washington were vaporized. The Pacific boiled under Chinese detonations, and Europe, already starved by decades of the resource wars, vanished beneath its own retaliatory fire. Within moments, the atmosphere darkened with ash, communications collapsed, and every bright light of the old world guttered out. Those who lived long enough to hear the silence afterward did not yet understand that the war was finished. They only knew the world had stopped answering. Vault doors thundered shut across the United States, sealing their populations in steel coffins meant to outlast the storm. Outside, cities became glass, the forests ignited, oceans turned to poison, and the jet streams carried death from continent to continent, until the whole planet breathed radiation. What remained of humanity divided in two: the buried and the burned. The buried inherited experiments. The burned inherited madness. Yet both carried the same flaw that had summoned the fire: the conviction that survival was victory. In that sense, the Great War never ended. It simply changed its scenery, transforming from the noise of bombs to the quieter cruelty of aftermath. Centuries later, the survivors' descendants would give names to what they found: ghouls, mutants, wastelanders. But the world they inhabited was still the battlefield their ancestors had built. The bombs had not rewritten human nature, they had preserved it. In the scorched husks of cities, children grew up playing among the bones of skyscrapers, and every relic of the old world whispered the same lesson: war never changes. It is the natural state of a species that mistakes progress for peace and survival for purpose. The Great War was the final invention of that species, the perfect union of its intelligence and its ignorance, and its echo is the world of Fallout itself, a museum where every ruin, every faction, and every act of violence remembers the day the world ended and humanity finally proved itself right. When the bombs fell and the deafening roar faded into a silence that blanketed the planet, what humanity inherited was not peace nor prosperity, but the bitter and unending aftermath of its own hubris, a world where survival became the new war, and where the rules that once governed civilization were now meaningless. The landscapes of America and beyond were transformed into territories of decay, their cities hollowed, their forests blackened, their rivers laced with radiation, and their soil so poisoned that even life itself seemed to stagger under the weight of the apocalypse. What remained of humanity was fragmented, scattered into enclaves, vaults, and nomadic bands, each clinging desperately to the scraps of pre-war knowledge and technology, yet constantly confronting the reality that civilization, as it had once been imagined, no longer existed. Raiders and scavengers, driven by instinct and hunger rather than ideology, claimed territories through violence, asserting dominance over those weaker, and in many regions, they became the new law, the new government, enforcing a brutal and arbitrary order that reflected both the worst impulses of mankind and the absence of the structures that had previously constrained them. Meanwhile, mutated creatures, super mutants born of the forced evolutionary virus, feral ghouls whose radiation-damaged bodies and minds roamed aimlessly, and mutated animals that had adapted to the new irradiated ecosystems, claimed dominion over regions abandoned by humans, reminding survivors daily that evolution and survival no longer aligned with human intention, but with the brutal mathematics of adaptation and predation. The remnants of organized groups like the Brotherhood of Steel, formed from splintered military units, and scientists intent on preserving technology and knowledge, began patrolling this new world, seeking to salvage what was left of the old civilization. But in doing so, they themselves became agents of a relentless, moralized form of control, enforcing their vision of order in a wasteland that offered none. The Enclave, secretive descendants of the American government, interpreted the destruction as both opportunity and divine right, conceiving of a world in which they would restore their own vision of America through authoritarian means, while simultaneously seeing everyone else as corrupted by the very anarchy they believed necessary to cleanse. Amid these power structures, nascent governments began to rise, like the new California Republic, trying to piece together law, democracy, and society from the fractured remnants of a world that had forgotten such ideals. And in their attempts, they too were forced to navigate constant conflict, resource scarcity, and moral compromise, proving that the wars of men had simply mutated into new forms, wearing new faces, but preserving the same essential truth, that conflict is inseparable from civilization itself. In scattered vaults where life had been preserved under artificial conditions, generations grew without knowing the outside world directly, emerging to confront the consequences of human arrogance and the physical and moral devastation it had wrought. The Vault Dweller, for example, discovered a world where technology, once a tool for comfort and progress, had become a weapon and a symbol of oppression, forcing individuals to navigate ethical dilemmas amidst a landscape that seemed designed to test not just survival, but character, ingenuity, and the capacity for compassion in a universe that had forgotten both. Across the wasteland, towns formed around water sources, arable land, and irradiated ruins that contained the remnants of pre-war infrastructure, and in these communities, life was a delicate negotiation between cooperation and conflict, innovation and preservation, hope and despair, while myths of the old world, stories of cities, institutions, and technologies that had been lost in the flash of nuclear fire served both as warnings and as inspiration, guiding some toward the reconstruction of society and others toward cycles of predation and domination. Radiation itself became both a literal and symbolic marker of humanity's failure, mutating bodies and minds, reshaping ecosystems, and creating a visceral, ever-present reminder that the costs of the resource wars and the Great War had not been borne equally, but imposed relentlessly, indiscriminately, and without mercy, echoing the lesson encoded in the phrase that would define this era, that war, in all its forms, never changes. Even attempts at diplomacy and stability, whether by minor factions or emergent powers, were shadowed by the omnipresent threat of renewed violence, as every faction had within its ranks those who remembered, or imagined, the old ways, and sought to assert their dominance through control, conquest, or survival, demonstrating that human nature itself, driven by fear, ambition, and desire for security, was as inexorable as the fallout that coated the land and sky. The wasteland, then, became both stage and teacher, illustrating in every irradiated valley, every broken city, and every contested settlement that peace was temporary and fragile, that life persisted not in the absence of war, but in its transformation, where survival, morality, and power were the weapons, and where every act, whether of compassion or cruelty, contributed to the ongoing story of humanity's confrontation with its own essence. From the ruins of Washington, D.C. to the sands of the Mojave, the echoes of pre-war civilization reverberated in the conflicts of the survivors, proving that even in the so-called peace after the bombs, every scavenger, skirmish, factional dispute, and personal act of violence was simply another chapter in the long, unbroken history of human conflict, reiterating the ultimate truth, first whispered before the apocalypse, and confirmed again in every generation that followed. War never changes. In the scorched aftermath of the Great War, as the fires cooled and the first tentative sprouts of life emerged from irradiated soil, humanity faced the monumental task of survival, not merely against the elements, but against itself, and from this crucible arose the first new orders of the post-apocalyptic world, entities that sought to impose structure, ideology, and meaning on a planet fractured by fire and ambition. The Brotherhood of Steel emerged from the remnants of the United States military, led by Roger Maxson, who, in the ruins of the West, recognized that knowledge and technology were the twin engines of both civilization and annihilation. The Brotherhood's mission became clear: to preserve the tools of the old world, not merely for convenience or profit, but as instruments of survival and guardianship. Even as their isolationist philosophy separated them from the lives and struggles of ordinary wastelanders, to the east, remnants of the U.S. government consolidated into what would become known as the Enclave, a secretive and authoritarian force determined to reassert dominance under the belief that purity, racial, ideological, and national, was the only path to restoring order, and in their eyes, the irradiated and mutated survivors were not citizens, but variables to be controlled, cleansed, or eliminated in pursuit of a sanitized vision of America reborn. Meanwhile, in the western reaches of the former United States, Shady Sands and the surrounding settlements coalesced into what would become the new California Republic, a nascent attempt at democracy and law in the midst of chaos, where leaders like Aradesh and later Tandy understood that governance required compromise, resources, and the willingness to negotiate with both raiders and former allies alike, proving that even amidst devastation, human societies instinctively sought structures that balanced authority, liberty, and survival. Across the Mojave, other factions arose. Caesar's Legion, built on the disciplined militarism and harsh ideology of Edward Sallow, forged a society predicated on conquest, slavery, and the brutal enforcement of order, illustrating the dark efficiency with which human hierarchies could reconstruct themselves even after the collapse of all prior systems. Each of these orders, despite their differences in philosophy, shared a common genesis: the necessity of imposing control where none naturally existed, a reflection of the broader truth of Fallout's world, that, in the absence of central authority, human beings instinctively reproduce power structures, often echoing the very hierarchies that had contributed to their previous destruction. Technology, ideology, and ideology-infused technology became the currency of power, and access to pre-war knowledge dictated both survival and dominance. Vault-Tech's influence persisted even in this new age, as the populations emerging from the vaults carried with them social conditioning, experimental traits, and knowledge curated by designers who had sought not merely to preserve life, but to manipulate it according to statistical projections and social hypotheses. leaving each vault dweller uniquely shaped for adaptation, leadership, or subjugation. Amid this complex tapestry, raiders, mutant enclaves, and scattered tribes continued to exert influence, often serving as catalysts for the larger factions to define themselves as their raids, migrations, and survival strategies forced the emerging orders to codify laws, doctrines, and military protocols, ensuring that even as humanity rebuilt, the shadow of conflict persisted, now internalized within these new systems, rather than imposed solely by external wars. Religion and philosophy also began to coalesce into new forms of social cohesion, exemplified by the children of Atom, who transformed the atomic fire that had once annihilated the world into a divine entity, interpreting radiation as sacred and nuclear detonations as holy events, thereby giving spiritual purpose to what had otherwise been senseless destruction, and illustrating the human tendency to seek meaning in catastrophe. This interplay of technology, ideology, and survivalist doctrine created a landscape in which every settlement, faction, and individual was part of an intricate web of competition and cooperation, where alliances were temporary, threats were constant, and the balance between morality and pragmatism was perpetually tested. Even small settlements had to navigate the moral and practical consequences of decisions that might ensure immediate survival, but propagate cycles of violence or dependency, proving that the same lessons of human nature that had led to the Resource Wars and the Great War remained embedded in the post-war consciousness. Over time, these new orders codified their visions, whether through military hierarchy, bureaucratic structures, or religious ritual, creating stability in localized regions, even as the world at large remained fractured, contaminated, and unpredictable. In this environment, the cycle of conflict persisted, transmuted into the governance, ideology, and survival strategies of the New World, confirming again the unchanging truth of humanity's history, articulated by every survivor, chronicler, and narrator that would come to remind the wasteland's denizens that despite the rise and fall of empires, the mutations of ideology, and the evolution of society itself, war, in its essence, never changes. In the wasteland that arose from the ashes of the Great War, power was no longer measured merely in wealth or territory, but in the capacity to impose one's vision of order on a fractured world. And with that, the ideology of power became the defining lens through which every faction, warlord, and survivor interpreted reality. The Enclave, clinging to the remnants of the pre-war United States, viewed themselves as the custodians of purity and authority. Their doctrine steeped in the belief that civilization could only be restored through rigorous control, technological superiority, and the removal of what they deemed corruption, mutants, ghouls, and those not born of their blood or culture, and in their eyes, moral absolutism justified acts of brutality, for to preserve the ideal was to preserve life itself, even if it meant the systematic eradication of entire communities. The Brotherhood of Steel, by contrast, interpreted power through the lens of preservation and knowledge. Technology was sacred, and authority derived not from dominion over people, but over the tools that could either rebuild or destroy civilization again, creating a hierarchy rooted in meritocracy, discipline, and the hoarding of knowledge, yet paradoxically imposing rigid orthodoxy, and often clashing with those who sought to wield technology for survival rather than ideology. Caesar's legion articulated power as a function of obedience, hierarchy, and conquest, where the individual was subsumed into the collective, and loyalty and fear were instruments for shaping human behavior, producing a society both efficient and ruthless, demonstrating that authority can be achieved as much through intimidation and indoctrination as through ideology or morality. The new California Republic offered yet another variant, one where legitimacy stemmed from law, representation, and negotiation, a fragile experiment in translating the pre-war ideals of democracy into a post-apocalyptic reality. Yet, even here, power was never absolute, for corruption, resource scarcity, and external threats constantly tested the limits of governance, showing that ideology alone cannot enforce control without practical enforcement and adaptability. Amid these structured factions, smaller groups, raider gangs, tribal collectives, and independent settlements crafted their own versions of authority, often blending survival instincts with philosophical justifications, proving that even the most rudimentary structures of power emerge from the same human desire to impose order on chaos. Religious movements, particularly the Children of Atom, transformed ideology into ritualized authority, wielding belief in radiation and nuclear fire to control followers and sanctify acts of destruction, illustrating how spiritual narratives can be as potent a tool of power as armies or technology. Across the wasteland, the exercise of power consistently revealed the interplay between survival, morality, and pragmatism, as leaders negotiated loyalty, resources, and fear, and in every case, the underlying principle remained constant. Power legitimizes itself through enforcement, belief, and the imposition of vision, yet it is never immune to challenge, corruption, or decay. In observing the varied manifestations of authority, from the militarized sanctuaries of the Brotherhood to the religious zeal of atom worshippers, from the disciplined tyranny of the Legion to the fragile bureaucracy of the NCR, one can trace the recurring patterns of human behavior, the desire to dominate, the need for order, and the instinct to control outcomes in a world where chaos has been made permanent. Even the smallest decisions, whether rationing water, choosing whether to intervene in a raider attack, or determining who may access pre-war technology, reflected the broader ideological currents of the wasteland, revealing that governance and morality are always intertwined with survival and that the exercise of power is never neutral. Across every region, every faction, and every individual, ideology shaped not only the structure of societies but the moral framework through which people judged themselves and others, illustrating that while the weapons, technology, and faces of authority might change, the principles governing power remain the same, confirming once more that war, in essence, is an expression of human nature, and the exercise of power, whether by overt force, religious fervor, or bureaucratic governance, is merely another continuation of the eternal conflicts that have defined humanity from the dawn of civilization to the irradiated ruins of the fallout world. In the silent aftermath of nuclear fire, as humanity struggled to reclaim fragments of life from the ashes, some turned not to politics or technology, but to the divine, and from the irradiated ruins arose a faith as strange as it was enduring, the Children of Atom, a religion that transformed destruction into divinity and radiation into a sacred symbol, proclaiming that the very forces that annihilated the old world were holy instruments, worthy of worship, and that those who survived, mutated, or unaltered were participants in a cosmic plan whose purpose transcended mortal understanding. The faith began in the radioactive zones of the American Southwest, where survivors encountered phenomena beyond comprehension, glowing clouds, irradiated water, and human mutations that seemed both grotesque and miraculous, and interpreted these as evidence of divine will, a message encoded in the atoms themselves. Followers of Atom preached that nuclear fire was not an agent of punishment but of creation, a purifier of the corrupt, and that radiation, which in ordinary understanding poisoned and destroyed, was a sacred medium, granting enlightenment or marking the chosen, and in doing so, they reframed the apocalypse itself as a moment of revelation rather than catastrophe. Across the Mojave, the Appalachians, and scattered settlements of the wasteland, these teachings took root among those whose lives had been shattered, offering certainty in a universe bereft of law, resources, or morality. In the Children of Atom's doctrine, power and faith intertwined, as devotion to the sacred fire was both a path to personal meaning and a form of social cohesion, binding communities together with rituals, hierarchy, and the promise of divine protection against a hostile world. In practical terms, the religion often justified acts of violence, sacrifice, and conquest, framing survival as a test of faith and obedience, and it frequently clashed with other factions over territory, ideology, and the interpretation of sacred signs, demonstrating that, even in post-apocalyptic spirituality, human tendencies toward control, hierarchy, and enforcement persisted. The nuclear apocalypse itself became scripture, with each detonation, irradiated field, and glowing ruin interpreted as parables or miracles, guiding the moral and social practices of believers, while leaders within the faith codified doctrine, enforced conformity, and wielded both fear and hope to consolidate authority, illustrating the enduring human impulse to create meaning and structure, even in circumstances where life itself had been reduced to chaos. Beyond the Mojave, in the ruins of the capital wasteland and the Commonwealth, Atom worshippers demonstrated the adaptability of religious belief, integrating pre-war remnants, mutated flora and fauna, and localized customs into their rituals, showing that ideology in the wasteland was never static, but evolved in response to environment, survival pressures, and cultural memory. The faith's emphasis on the sacredness of atomic fire also reflected a deeper philosophical principle intrinsic to the Fallout universe, that destruction and creation are inseparable, that the same force that ends lives can redefine them, and that the moral frameworks of human societies are perpetually shaped by the instruments of their potential annihilation. In this sense, the Children of Atom were not merely a religious movement, but a living testament to the adaptability and resilience of human cognition, transforming fear and trauma into structure, narrative, and purpose, while simultaneously serving as a cautionary example of how dogma can sanctify destruction and normalize cycles of violence. The rise of atom worship highlighted a fundamental truth of the post-war world. Even in a landscape dominated by mutated beasts, raiders, and ideological factions, humans seek order, meaning, and authority, and when conventional structures fail, they turn to transcendental explanations, often producing systems that reflect, rather than negate, the conflicts of the material world. In this way, the Children of Atom exemplified the duality of power and belief, demonstrating that faith can be both salvation and weapon, a guide for morality and a justification for brutality, and that in the irradiated deserts and ruined cities, ideology, whether political, technological, or religious, remained the engine driving human behavior, ensuring that even in worship, war never truly changed. Across every glowing sanctuary, every ritual sacrifice, and every whispered prayer to the divine fire, the wasteland bore witness to the unbroken continuity of human ambition, the eternal interplay of morality and survival, and the persistent lesson of fallout itself, that even when the instruments of destruction are deified, the essence of conflict, the struggle to impose vision, order, and meaning, remains immutable, unyielding, and universal. In the post-apocalyptic landscape, as the irradiated Earth healed slowly and human survivors struggled to redefine society, the rise of the Institute and its creations, the synths, revealed a new dimension of conflict, one that blurred the boundaries between man and machine, morality and survival, demonstrating that the cycles of war and control in the fallout world were not merely physical, but philosophical, technological, and existential. The Institute, operating in the hidden depths beneath the Commonwealth, embodied the culmination of pre-war technological ambition, a society where scientific progress had become the ultimate form of authority, and knowledge was wielded as power, often without consideration for the moral or human cost. Within its laboratories, synths, artificial humans created with such precision that they were indistinguishable from flesh and blood, served both as instruments and as provocateurs, raising profound ethical questions about identity, autonomy, and the essence of humanity itself, while simultaneously allowing the Institute to exercise absolute control over its environment, manipulate surface settlements, and project influence far beyond its physical confines. This reliance on technology as a form of governance mirrored the pre-war belief in control through invention, showing that even after the devastation of nuclear war, humanity remained committed to solving problems by engineering obedience, efficiency, and dominance, rather than cultivating trust, empathy, or moral consensus. Surface dwellers, encountering synths indistinguishable from their own kind, faced a dilemma that had no precedent: to kill, to trust, or to negotiate with beings who were simultaneously human and other, alive and artificial, mirrors of the old world's hubris and warnings of the new. And every interaction became a microcosm of the broader philosophical question inherent in fallout. If technology can replicate humanity, what becomes of morality, choice, and accountability? The Institute's philosophy reinforced the recurring theme that power and knowledge, if concentrated and unchecked, inevitably perpetuate cycles of conflict, and its isolation from the wasteland echoed the pre-war elite's detachment, suggesting that the tools of survival can also become instruments of oppression, even when wielded with ostensibly noble intentions. Attempts by factions like the Railroad to liberate synths underscored the moral complexity of the age, as advocates for autonomy confronted an organization that equated obedience to protocol with preservation of life, and each conflict, whether covert sabotage, negotiation, or direct confrontation, illustrated the enduring tension between progress and ethics, individual rights and collective survival, freedom and order. At the same time, the emergence of advanced robotics and artificial intelligence, mechanical sentries, MR, handy units, and other automated constructs demonstrated that even simple tools could become extensions of ideology and power, amplifying the consequences of human decision-making and magnifying the stakes of every miscalculation. The wasteland's surviving populations, caught between factions like the Brotherhood of Steel, the Institute, and the Railroad, experienced firsthand the reality that the human impulse to dominate, innovate, and survive remained unchanged, and that every technological advance could serve both life and death, depending on the wielder's intent. echoing the old world's lesson that inventions are never neutral and that moral and political responsibility cannot be outsourced to machines. This interplay between man and machine, control and autonomy, mirrored the broader cycles of the Fallout universe, revealing that even in a world rebuilt from ash, humanity cannot escape the repetition of history for the desire to govern, to protect, to dominate, and to impose vision persists across generations and iterations of civilization, whether carried out by flesh, code, or hybrid constructs. The Institute's existence and its conflicts also highlighted a fundamental truth of the post-war era, that survival was no longer merely a physical struggle against radiation, mutants, or raiders, but a contest of ideas, ethics, and philosophies, where every choice, scientific, political, or personal, shaped the emerging civilization and determined the balance between liberation and control. In synthesizing human ingenuity and artificial replication, the Institute offered a stark reflection of pre-war arrogance, showing that even in hiding, humanity repeats itself, building hierarchies, defending dogma, and engaging in moral compromises under the guise of progress, proving once again that war, in essence, is unchanging, and that human nature, whether in steel, flesh, or synthetic flesh, remains a constant engine of conflict. Across the Commonwealth, every liberated synth, every infiltration mission, every interaction between human and machine became a testament to this enduring truth, a living chronicle of the challenges of reconstructing civilization after its collapse, and a reminder that the struggle between innovation, morality, and power is never resolved, only perpetuated, proving that even in a world dominated by artificial intelligence, the lessons of the past endure, and the phrase that has echoed through centuries, "War never changes," remains as valid in the corridors of the Institute as it does across the irradiated deserts, cities, and mountains of the wasteland. In the aftermath of nuclear fire, as the ash settled and irradiated landscapes revealed the sheer magnitude of human folly, the task of rebuilding civilization emerged not simply as a question of survival, but as an intricate political endeavor, one in which the fragile and dispersed populations of the wasteland attempted to recreate governance, law, and societal structures in a world that had been stripped of the safeguards, infrastructure, and moral compacts that once sustained them. Nowhere was this more apparent than in the emergence of the new California Republic, the enigmatic strategies of Mr. House in New Vegas, and the grassroots organizing of the Minutemen in the Commonwealth, each a different approach to the same underlying challenge: how to impose order, enforce rules, and define morality in a landscape dominated by scarcity, fear, and competing ideologies. The NCR rose from the ruins of Shady Sands and the surrounding settlements, taking the ideals of democracy, representation, and bureaucratic governance, and attempting to implement them across vast and hostile territories. Yet the very expansion that was meant to consolidate stability also reproduced the inequalities, corruption, and logistical challenges of the old world, as governors, military officers, and local magistrates found themselves negotiating between enforcing law, collecting resources, and managing the ambitions of local power brokers, illustrating that even in attempts to create peace, human nature and the necessities of survival inevitably reintroduce the potential for conflict. In contrast, Robert House, the pre-war magnate who survived in the hidden security of his fort, approached governance as an exercise in calculated control, technological mastery, and centralized authority, seeking to rebuild Las Vegas and its environs as a self-contained utopia in which human behavior could be predicted, directed, and optimized through surveillance, robotics, and careful manipulation. Yet even this vision, stripped of democratic process and reliant on the subjugation of freedom for order, demonstrated the enduring tension between liberty and security, between individual will and collective stability, showing that the methods by which humans attempt to enforce peace often replicate the authoritarian impulses that led to war in the first place. The Minutemen, by contrast, embodied a decentralized, participatory form of governance, rooted in local communities and mutual defense. Yet, their reliance on volunteerism, consensus, and moral authority rather than coercive power revealed both the strengths and limitations of a model that sought to empower ordinary citizens while simultaneously confronting the harsh realities of the wasteland, where raiders, mutant threats, and resource scarcity demanded immediate and sometimes uncompromising action, illustrating that even altruistic and democratic approaches to governance must contend with the immutable pressures that give rise to conflict. Across these examples, the recurring theme was clear. The political act of rebuilding cannot escape the structural and psychological imperatives that generate war. Every law enforced, every resource allocated, and every military decision made is imbued with the potential for domination, dispute, and rebellion, reflecting the fact that peace is never a static state, but a precarious balance constantly threatened by the forces, human and environmental, that shaped the apocalypse. Governance in the wasteland also revealed the interplay between ideology and pragmatism. As leaders sought to justify their actions through rhetoric, historical analogy, or appeals to collective survival, even when those justifications masked coercion, exploitation, or morally ambiguous choices, underscoring the enduring human tendency to legitimize power through narrative and principle, regardless of context or consequence. In settlements controlled by the NCR, laws codified the protection of property, commerce, and territory, yet these laws also created friction with independent communities, tribal groups, and rival factions, producing conflicts that mirrored the pre-war struggles over land, resources, and authority, proving that even the most well-intentioned government can reproduce the conditions of war when confronted with finite resources and competing claims of legitimacy. House's technocratic model, while efficient and insulated, relied on suppression of dissent, surveillance, and manipulation of both humans and machines, illustrating the paradox inherent in centralized authority, that attempts to maintain order through control can generate cycles of rebellion, resistance, and unrest, and that technological mastery cannot eliminate the fundamental social and moral challenges inherent in human societies. The Minutemen, operating from a decentralized network of local chapters, often found themselves confronting the same dilemmas, balancing the autonomy of communities with the need for coordinated defense, negotiating moral choices under duress, and attempting to maintain cohesion in a world where communication, trust, and infrastructure were fragile at best, demonstrating that even grassroots governance must navigate the same principles of power, authority, and conflict that shaped the empires and factions of the past. Together, these approaches revealed a central truth of the post-war era, that the attempt to rebuild civilization, whether through democracy, autocracy, or community-based organization, is inseparable from the conditions that produce war, because the exercise of power, the management of scarcity, and the enforcement of order inevitably generate both resistance and moral compromise, and every act of governance, carries the shadow of conflict within it. The wasteland thus became a laboratory in which the principles of human society were tested anew. The desire for security, order, and prosperity collided with the reality of human imperfection, environmental limitation, and historical memory, producing societies that were at once innovative, fragile, and perpetually at risk of collapse. In observing the NCR, House, and the Minutemen, one sees the unbroken continuity of human behavior across eras, the drive to impose vision, the negotiation of morality under pressure, and the inescapable recurrence of conflict, showing that even when war appears to have ended, its mechanisms and lessons persist, embedded within every decision, law, and military action. In this way, the politics of rebuilding is not merely the management of society, but a reflection of the eternal cycles that define human existence, confirming the immutable truth, articulated across Fallout's narratives, that the structures and impulses that led to war survive every apocalypse, manifesting in governance, ideology, and everyday survival, and ensuring that even in the pursuit of peace, the underlying patterns of war never truly change. Even as the survivors of the Great War carved out fragile existences amid irradiated ruins, the remnants of the old world lingered like shadows across the wasteland, haunting the living with ideologies, symbols, and stories that had survived nuclear fire, decay, and the collapse of centralized authority, and ensuring that the cultural, moral, and political frameworks that had led to humanity's near annihilation were never entirely forgotten. Propaganda posters, faded corporate logos, pre-war advertisements, and the relics of governance, vaulted architecture, pre-war military insignias, and public service announcements preserved in vaults or scavenged by wanderers continued to shape behavior, inform beliefs, and inspire both reverence and resentment, demonstrating that even in the absence of functioning institutions, cultural memory has a power of its own, capable of guiding, manipulating, and constraining human societies. The myth of the American dream, long propagated as a vision of prosperity, freedom, and upward mobility, became a spectral influence in the wasteland, a narrative that survivors and new factions clung to as both aspiration and justification for action, even as the material reality of life was defined by scarcity, violence, and survival. This dream, in many ways, functioned as a form of ideological radiation, invisible yet penetrating, shaping loyalties, ambitions, and conflicts across generations. Factions such as the NCR attempted to reconstruct pre-war ideals, invoking civic duty, law, and progress as foundational principles, yet in doing so, they inherited the flaws, contradictions, and moral compromises of the old society, replicating social hierarchies, bureaucratic inefficiencies, and economic inequalities, which in turn generated tension, corruption, and localized conflict, proving that the ideas of the old world endure not as abstract history, but as practical forces capable of shaping outcomes in the post-apocalyptic landscape. Similarly, institutions like the Brotherhood of Steel, while rejecting much of pre-war culture in favor of technological preservation, nonetheless perpetuated hierarchies, militaristic discipline, and moral orthodoxy, rooted in pre-war military traditions, showing that even rejection of the old world is itself a form of engagement with its legacy, and that the ghosts of past structures persist in shaping ideology, practice, and conflict. The wasteland is also haunted by the subtler echoes of propaganda, as pre-war media recordings, educational films, and entertainment continue to circulate, sometimes preserved in vaults, libraries, or scavenged terminals, conveying messages of loyalty, duty, and societal purpose, while simultaneously demonstrating the seductive power of narrative to shape perception, influence decision-making, and enforce conformity even centuries after the collapse of the societies that produced them. Survivors interpret these fragments in diverse ways. Some treat them as sacred or aspirational texts, others as cautionary relics, while yet others exploit them for personal or political gain, reinforcing the notion that cultural memory is both tool and weapon, capable of perpetuating ideals as well as conflict. The persistence of pre-war ideology is particularly visible in the recurring emphasis on nationalism, corporate loyalty, and the valorization of military service, which continue to inform factional politics, justify expansionist behavior, and lend moral weight to territorial disputes, echoing the same mechanisms that originally generated war in the resource wars and the global tensions leading up to the Great War. Nostalgia for the Old World also manifests in the obsessive preservation of architecture, technology, and social rituals, as seen in settlements that attempt to recreate pre-war aesthetics, protocols, and institutions, often without fully grasping their function, reflecting the human tendency to cling to symbols, even when the underlying systems have been destroyed or corrupted. In this way, the wasteland itself becomes a living museum, where ruins, relics, and stories are simultaneously instructive, misleading, and morally influential, ensuring that the mindset behind war, the desire for control, the belief in progress as linear and inevitable, and the justification of dominance through ideology persists, shaping every interaction, every alliance, and every conflict. Raiders, militarized factions, and governments alike are influenced by these ghosts, consciously or unconsciously, reenacting patterns of ambition, hierarchy, and aggression learned from pre-war culture, demonstrating that the human proclivity for conflict is rarely a product of circumstance alone, but of inherited thought, ideology, and narrative reinforced across generations. Ultimately, the ghosts of the old world reveal that survival in the wasteland is not only a matter of physical endurance, but of navigating the moral, cultural, and ideological legacies left by those who came before, and that war, as a reflection of human nature, is sustained not merely through weapons and resources, but through stories, symbols, and memories that persist, haunting every settlement, faction, and individual with the unchanging lesson that the past is never truly past, and that the mindset which produced the apocalypse endures, shaping the present and ensuring that in Fallout's world, the refrain resonates endlessly: war never changes. Amid the irradiated ruins of a world shattered by human folly, the story of the individual emerges as both beacon and mirror for the survivors who venture from the relative safety of vaults, settlements, or hidden enclaves, are not only fighting for their own survival, but are also confronted with the eternal, unchanging dilemmas that have defined human civilization, questions of morality, authority, and consequence that transcend time and circumstance, and it is through the lens of these protagonists, from the vault dweller of the capital wasteland, to the chosen one of the Mojave, to the lone wanderer and sole survivor of the Commonwealth, that the cyclical nature of war, power, and human behavior is rendered palpable, illustrating that even as empires rise and fall, Factions collide, and the Earth slowly heals from radiation. The choices, values, and actions of the individual remain central to the narrative of survival and ethical responsibility. Each protagonist, though situated in a unique geographical and temporal context, encounters the same fundamental questions: how to reconcile self-preservation with altruism, how to exercise power without succumbing to tyranny, and how to navigate a landscape where law is fragmented, morality is subjective, and every decision carries profound ramifications for both themselves and the fragile societies around them, proving that personal agency is both a privilege and a burden in a world dominated by the consequences of collective failure. The Vault Dweller, emerging from Vault 13, is thrust into a wasteland teeming with mutation, scarcity, and human conflict, and must balance the immediate needs of their home community with the broader implications of intervention, exemplifying the tension between local loyalty and global consequence, while encountering moral quandaries that range from the liberation of enslaved ghouls to the negotiation of peace between warring factions, showing that heroism is inseparable from ethical complexity. In the Mojave, the courier navigates a politically fragmented environment in which the NCR, Caesar's Legion, and Mr. House each pursue different visions of order and control, forcing the protagonist to weigh the benefits and costs of allegiance, neutrality, or subversion, and to confront the realization that every act intended to bring stability or justice may inadvertently reinforce cycles of conflict, highlighting the inherent tension between individual morality and the structural imperatives of war and governance. Similarly, the Lone Wanderer and the sole survivor of Fallout 3 and Fallout 4, respectively, are placed in environments where the exercise of choice becomes the central medium through which the ethics of survival and reconstruction are explored. Whether it is rescuing populations, redistributing resources, or determining the fates of synths, supermutants, or entire factions, each decision is an experiment in balancing immediate human needs with the long-term consequences of intervention, and every outcome demonstrates that even the most virtuous intentions are enmeshed in a broader context of systemic instability and enduring conflict. Across all these narratives, the individual functions simultaneously as agent and observer, their actions shaping the course of history, while revealing the limitations imposed by inherited structures, environmental pressures, and human nature itself. And in this way, they embody the duality of freedom and constraint. They can choose, act, and innovate, yet they remain bound by the consequences of choices made before them and by the unchanging principles that govern human society, including competition, aggression, and the desire for survival and control. This interplay between personal morality and systemic forces illustrates a core principle of the Fallout universe, that while war and conflict may be cyclical and inevitable on the macro scale, the choices of individuals serve as microcosms through which these cycles are enacted, resisted, or mitigated, demonstrating that the ethical weight of history is carried not only by factions and governments, but also by the solitary wanderer navigating ruins, radiation, and the fractured morality of a world remade. The narratives of these protagonists also emphasize the role of empathy, adaptability, and vision in shaping the course of post-apocalyptic societies, revealing that individual action can either perpetuate destruction or foster cooperation, and that heroism is defined not solely by survival, but by the capacity to recognize the ethical complexity inherent in every choice the interdependence of communities, and the inevitability of unintended consequences. Ultimately, the individual in the ashes stands as both witness and participant in an eternal pattern. They confront the same moral dilemmas, structural limitations, and human failings that precipitated the apocalypse itself, proving that the cycle of conflict, power, and survival is not merely a product of factions, ideology, or technology, but also of the choices, courage, and conscience of those who must navigate the world that remains, ensuring that the fundamental truth remains visible and unbroken across every era, every wasteland, and every generation, that war never changes. In the wasteland, where law has crumbled, resources are scarce, and survival is constant, violence is neither anomaly nor accident. It is the framework through which order is imposed, hierarchy established, and human relationships, however tenuous, maintained, and throughout the Fallout series, this principle is visible in the everyday reality of the irradiated world, where raiders enforce dominance through brutality, factions impose their ideologies through military power, and even acts of altruism are often mediated through coercion or force, demonstrating that violence, far from being chaotic, functions as a structural constant that governs human behavior, social cohesion, and the distribution of power. From the predations of raider gangs to the disciplined campaigns of Caesar's Legion, the calibrated interventions of the Brotherhood of Steel, and the militarized enforcement of the NCR, each manifestation of violence serves a dual purpose. It eliminates threats while simultaneously delineating moral, social, and territorial boundaries, signaling both to allies and adversaries the limits of tolerance and the stakes of transgression, and revealing that in a world stripped of pre-war institutions, physical conflict becomes the primary language of negotiation, legitimacy, and survival. At a philosophical level, the wasteland demonstrates that violence is inseparable from civilization itself. Those who fail to exercise force risk subjugation, exploitation, or annihilation, while those who wield it judiciously can establish communities, enforce law, and protect resources, illustrating that aggression and defense are not antithetical to order, but integral to its creation and maintenance, and that moral frameworks in Fallout are often defined by the capacity to act decisively under threat. Even technology, often heralded as a tool for progress, becomes an instrument of violence. From energy weapons and nuclear arms to automated sentries and experimental synths, revealing that human ingenuity is frequently employed not to circumvent conflict, but to magnify its reach and consequences, and that mastery of these tools is inseparable from mastery of social and ethical power. Individuals, too, are caught within this structure, their choices constantly mediated by potential threats and the necessity of force, whether deciding to kill or spare, to liberate or subjugate, and each decision echoes the broader lesson that survival and morality are intertwined with violence, and that in the absence of centralized legal authority, ethical reasoning is inseparable from the capacity to enforce it physically. In factional politics, violence functions as legitimacy. Caesar's Legion imposes order through fear and discipline, defining loyalty through the threat of death. The NCR enforces compliance via military and bureaucratic means, demonstrating that even democratic ideals require coercion to maintain stability. And House exerts control technologically and strategically, showing that violence need not be overt to achieve dominance, but its latent presence undergirds all authority. Even within ostensibly neutral or benevolent groups, the underlying reliance on violence persists. Minutemen patrols, settlements militias, and caravan security all rely on readiness to apply force as a stabilizing principle, proving that the moral and social fabric of the wasteland is woven with threads of coercion, defense, and calculated aggression. At the societal level, violence also acts as an equalizer, enforcing consequences where pre-war privilege or wealth no longer guarantees immunity, and allowing new hierarchies to emerge based on capability, cunning, and courage, rather than inherited status. Yet even here, the pattern mirrors pre-apocalyptic cycles of power, showing that human nature consistently reproduces conflict as a mechanism of social ordering. On a narrative and symbolic plane, Fallout repeatedly emphasizes that violence is a tool of existential clarity. It strips away illusion, tests morality, and defines agency, compelling both player and character to confront the reality that in a post-apocalyptic landscape, ethical and survival imperatives are inseparable, and that human values are often articulated most clearly through decisions made under threat. Ritualized violence. From the hierarchies of the Legion to raider initiations, the suppression of dissent in technological enclaves, and the struggles of independent settlements, further demonstrates that the repetition of conflict is not chaotic, but a disciplined process through which authority, loyalty, and social cohesion are maintained, showing that war, aggression, and confrontation are not anomalies, but essential processes for the continuation of human society. Ultimately, the meaning of violence in Fallout is both practical and philosophical. It is the mechanism through which civilizations enforce their vision, the medium through which individuals assert agency, and the constant reminder that, regardless of ideology, location, or technological advancement, conflict is both inevitable and necessary, ensuring that in a world perpetually defined by scarcity, ambition, and human nature, the refrain remains true and immutable. War never changes. In the irradiated expanse of the wasteland, where communities struggle to restore what was lost, the notion of progress emerges not as a linear triumph of human ingenuity, but as a recurring illusion for every settlement, faction, and technological marvel. Whether the sprawling bureaucracy of the NCR, the methodical preservationism of the Brotherhood of Steel, or the centralized oversight of Mr. House, inevitably reproduces the social, political, and environmental pressures that precipitated the Great War, revealing that attempts to learn from history are often constrained by the unchanging patterns of human behavior and the immutable logic of scarcity, survival, and ambition. The cycles of construction and destruction persist, demonstrating that progress is less a destination than a recurring struggle to balance knowledge, power, and morality in a world still governed by the same forces that once toppled civilization. The NCR, in its efforts to expand democratic governance and establish law across vast territories, mirrors pre-war attempts to consolidate resources, impose political control, and define national identity. Yet the same mechanisms that produce cohesion, bureaucracy, taxation, and military enforcement also generate friction, corruption, and inequality, creating conditions ripe for rebellion, exploitation, and conflict, proving that the very structures meant to ensure stability carry within them the seeds of instability and war. The Brotherhood of Steel's obsessive focus on technological preservation reflects a similar paradox. Their strict hierarchies, insular policies, and hoarding of knowledge are designed to protect humanity from repeating its mistakes. Yet in doing so, they restrict innovation, concentrate power, and isolate themselves from the wider world, ensuring that when confrontation does occur, it is magnified by the very tools and knowledge they have monopolized, demonstrating that the pursuit of protection without flexibility inevitably reproduces cycles of conflict. Mr. House's vision for New Vegas, grounded in technological mastery and calculated control, similarly illustrates the illusion of progress, while he seeks efficiency, order, and stability. Through predictive algorithms, robotic enforcers, and careful oversight, the inherent unpredictability of human choice, ambition, and dissent constantly threatens his utopia, proving that even the most sophisticated and rationalized systems cannot escape the social and moral dynamics that drive conflict. Across the wasteland, settlements and factions attempting reconstruction are continually forced to confront the consequences of resource scarcity, environmental hazards, and the ethical compromises necessary for survival, showing that progress is perpetually constrained by circumstance, and that human efforts to impose order inevitably encounter the same tensions, failures, and cycles that defined pre-war society. The illusion of progress is further compounded by the persistence of ideology, cultural memory, and inherited social structures, as communities invoke pre-war ideals, emulate past hierarchies, and cling to narratives of civilization, demonstrating that the psychological and moral dimensions of human behavior are as resistant to change as the material conditions of the world, and that attempts to build anew are always shadowed by the patterns, mistakes, and conflicts of the old world. Even acts of altruism, innovation, and moral leadership cannot fully escape these cycles. Choices that seem to promote stability or justice often produce unintended consequences, redistribute power unevenly, or provoke resistance, illustrating that the pursuit of progress is fraught with moral ambiguity, and that the lessons of history are rarely internalized in a way that prevents repetition. The wasteland's recurring pattern is clear. Human ambition, constrained by environment, resources, and social structures, perpetuates cycles of creation and destruction, and each era of reconstruction inevitably sets the stage for the next conflict, whether through the accumulation of power, the centralization of resources, or the emergence of ideological schisms, proving that the tragedy of civilization is its tendency to repeat itself even in the wake of near-total annihilation. At a philosophical level, the myth of progress underscores the unchanging nature of human behavior. The same desires for security, control, recognition, and survival that drove the world to nuclear fire continue to drive individuals and factions in the wasteland, showing that moral lessons are secondary to the imperatives of life and that structural conditions shape behavior as much as ethical aspiration, rendering every new beginning a continuation of the same fundamental cycles. Ultimately, the wasteland demonstrates that progress, while desirable, is neither linear nor guaranteed. It is fragile, provisional, and constantly threatened by human ambition, scarcity, and the ethical compromises that define survival, confirming the recurring truth that while technologies, governments, and ideologies may change, the underlying patterns of conflict, hierarchy, and repetition remain. And in every act of rebuilding, every new order, and every attempt at restoration, the refrain echoes with immutable clarity: war never changes. As the wasteland stretches endlessly across irradiated deserts, ruined cities, and scarred landscapes. The refrain, "War never changes," resonates not merely as a warning, but as a profound observation of human civilization. For every act of survival, every conflict between factions, every struggle over territory and resources, and every moral choice made by individuals and societies alike reflects the immutable patterns that have defined humanity from pre-war to post-apocalypse, illustrating that while technology, ideology, and circumstance may evolve, the underlying impulses that drive conflict, ambition, fear, greed, survival, and the assertion of control remain constant, eternal, and unyielding. Across eras, from the corporate and resource-driven conflicts of pre-war America through the global crises that led to the Great War of 2077 and into the fragmented societies of the wasteland, the same principles manifest repeatedly. The desire to dominate, the use of ideology to justify action, the imposition of order through violence, and the inevitable emergence of cycles of power and rebellion, demonstrating that war is not simply an event, but a reflection of human nature itself. Every faction, from the NCR, Brotherhood of Steel, and Enclave, to Caesar's Legion, Mr. House, and the Children of Atom, embodies a different philosophy of control, survival, or belief, yet each reproduces familiar patterns. Hierarchy enforced through violence or ideology, resource management entangled with conflict, and the persistent negotiation between freedom and authority, showing that even post-apocalyptic attempts at civilization cannot escape the structural and moral imperatives that generated war in the first place. Individual protagonists, from vault dwellers to the sole survivor, exemplify the microcosmic reflection of these cycles. Their choices, illuminating the tension between ethics, survival, and the necessity of action, in a world where every decision carries consequences that reverberate across communities and generations, proving that the ethical dilemmas faced by humans are inseparable from the realities of scarcity, risk, and the need to assert agency within hostile environments. Violence, far from being chaotic, functions as the glue of the wasteland, structuring relationships, enforcing boundaries, and producing hierarchies, while simultaneously serving as a metric of morality and survival, where decisions to act or abstain shape the fabric of civilization, and where even altruism is inseparable from the capacity to exert force or authority. The persistent echoes of the old world, propaganda, nostalgia, technological relics, and ideological memory reinforce this continuity, demonstrating that culture, narrative, and inherited social structures perpetuate the patterns of ambition, conflict, and moral compromise, ensuring that history repeats not out of inevitability alone, but through the transmission of memory, expectation, and socialization. Attempts at reconstruction, whether through democratic governance, technocratic control, or grassroots organization, illustrate the fragility of peace and the inevitability of tension. Every effort to impose order reintroduces structural pressures, scarcity-driven competition, and moral compromise, proving that progress is provisional and that human behavior, driven by fundamental needs and impulses, will reproduce conditions for conflict regardless of context. Even spiritual movements, from the Children of Atom to emergent cults and local religions, reflect the human desire to find meaning, impose order, and justify actions through ideology, and in doing so, they reveal that the tools of morality, belief, and social cohesion can simultaneously generate peace and perpetuate cycles of violence. underscoring the complex interplay between faith, authority, and survival. Technology, too, is both savior and agent of repetition. From pre-war nuclear weapons to the synths of the Institute, energy weapons, and automated defense systems, showing that human innovation amplifies both potential for creation and destruction, that mastery over tools requires ethical and practical wisdom, and that the lessons of history cannot be circumvented through invention alone. Ultimately, the wasteland is a mirror of the eternal cycles of human behavior, a landscape in which every act of rebuilding, every conflict, every ethical choice, and every assertion of power reflects the same fundamental truths observed in every era of human existence: that war is an expression of nature, morality is inseparable from survival, and human ambition reproduces the conditions of conflict even in the most desolate or carefully managed circumstances. War never changes is thus not simply an opening line or thematic flourish of a video game. It is the culmination of centuries of human history, a reflection encoded in the narratives, factions, and experiences of the Fallout universe, and a reminder that despite technological triumphs, ideological evolutions, and the passing of generations, the core dynamics of human conflict remain immutable, ensuring that in every act of survival, governance, or belief, the eternal patterns of ambition, violence, and moral struggle persist, reaffirming that in the ashes of the old world and the fragile constructions of the new, humanity remains bound to the lessons, errors, and eternal truths that have always defined it, and that no matter how far we rebuild or evolve, the refrain remains as inexorable and haunting as the radioactive winds across the wasteland: war never changes.